Good morning. My name is Katharine Stevens, and I am delighted to be here today. It is really an honor for me to have the opportunity to speak to such an extraordinary group of leaders in this state. I want to begin by saying thank you to Governor Bryant and to Scott Waller for inviting me to Mississippi to participate in today's event. I also want to thank Lori Smith from the governor's office, who reached out to me over a year and a half ago, and is how I had the good fortune to connect with Mississippi in the first place. So today's event is going to address how early childhood matters a lot to workforce development, both to a strong workforce today and to a strong workforce tomorrow. I'm going to present on how early childhood lays the critical foundation for Mississippi's future workforce. And after my presentation, our panel is going to discuss why early childhood is also so important to a strong workforce right now. In my presentation, I'm going to share with you some recent scientific findings that really upend how we've long thought about early childhood education. What scientists are establishing is that a child's earliest brain development, in particular from birth to age 3, sets the foundation that all future development is built on. My presentation is going to explain those findings and the important implications they have for early childhood policy and even for education policy more broadly. So, I'm here to talk about early childhood, but I want to start by talking for just a minute about school. Oops. For most of the 20th century, school was the pathway to a successful future in America. We've long viewed the public schools as the key to ensuring opportunity for every child and as the critical pipeline for developing a strong workforce. And over the last several decades, we've dedicated a great deal of energy and resources to making sure that the schools work for all children. This focus on schooling served our purposes for many decades. But it's become increasingly clear that today the K-12 schools are simply failing to ensure opportunity for all students and prepare new generations for productive work. In Mississippi, among fourth graders, less than a third were proficient in math and 1/4 were proficient in reading on the widely respected 2017 National Assessment of Education Progress, or NAEP exam. Just 1/5 of 8th graders were proficient in math and 1/4 in reading. Among low-income children, which in Mississippi is about 78% of children, close to half of both 4th and 8th graders scored below basic, the lowest of NAEP's 4 achievement levels in reading. And fewer than 1 in 10 11th graders met all 4 college readiness benchmarks on the national ACT exam in 2018. These outcomes are not unique to Mississippi, by the way. This is a common picture across the United States. Nor are these outcomes for lack of trying. In Mississippi, per student public spending on the K-12 schools has almost tripled in today's dollars since 1970, from about $3,000 per student in 1970 to almost $9,000 today in constant 2018 dollars, even as you see that children's achievement scores on the national NAEP exam have remained entirely flat. And across the country, in addition to spending much more money, we've been trying a whole range of approaches to improve the K-12 schools. Everything from standards and accountability to school choice to Common Core. We've thought maybe more school is the answer. And we added kindergarten, so children start school when they're 5 instead of 6. Now we're adding pre-K, so they start when they're 4 instead of 5. Good schools are critical, especially in the youngest grades. But a growing body of evidence is suggesting that we may be looking for solutions in the wrong place and at the wrong time. In fact, a rapidly growing body of science is now telling us that the achievement gap emerges much earlier than we've realized. Gaps between advantaged and disadvantaged children begin emerging as early as 9 months of age. By 18 months, toddlers from low-income families can already be several months behind in language development. And those gaps continue to widen, leaving disadvantaged children up to 2 years behind by age 5. Among entering kindergartens in Mississippi, for example, almost 2/3 are assessed as not ready for school. And almost half of all entering kindergartens in Mississippi are ranked at the lowest of 4 readiness levels, starting kindergarten with only limited knowledge of shapes, colors, numbers, and letters. So here's the bottom line. The achievement gap neither originates in nor can be closed by the schools. In fact, recent research has shown that this is the root of the achievement gap. Many children are entering school unprepared to succeed. School is failing to close those initial gaps. So as we've been focusing so intently on school, what we've been missing is the importance of children's earliest years. At the same time, a rapidly growing body of science provides us with 2 key concepts that explain why the earliest period, really the first 1,000 days of life, matter so much for children's development. The first of these is that brains are built, not born. The human brain is constructed of about 100 billion brain cells. Those brain cells function because of trillions of connections called synapses that many of you have heard of. A baby is born with just about all 100 billion brain cells that we as adults have. But those cells are very poorly connected. When we're born, we have very few synapses connecting the brain cells. Those connections are created at a rate of 1 million per second, starting at birth, in a rapid, ongoing process, which is literally wiring the brain. But that wiring doesn't just happen. The brain synapses are created and strengthened through a young child's experience in his environment, and most especially his interactions with the people around him. And what all that means is that foundational human development begins not in school and not at age 5 or 4 or even 3, but at birth. This is what that looks like on the outside, and this is what science has discovered is happening on the inside. On the far left, you see a diagram of a baby's brain cells and the synapses connecting them at birth. As you see, there are very few connections between the cells. Then over the first 2 years of life, those connections develop very rapidly as the brain is constructed from the ground up. In fact, more is happening in the years from birth to age 3 than in any other period of human life. If our brains were all to start developing at that rate, we would be Nobel Prize-winning scientists and Olympic athletes within 2 years. That's how rapid the rate of change is in this period. So for the first key concept is that brains are built, not born. The wiring of the brain begins at birth in an intensive process that does not happen automatically, but is driven by children's ongoing day-to-day interactions with the people around them. And this is the second key concept. Over the past half-century, scientists have discovered what are described as critical periods of development. Critical periods are stages of development during which a particular skill or capacity is especially sensitive to influences in the environment. One way of understanding how critical periods work in the development of the human brain is through a metaphor of wet concrete. When concrete is just laid, the slightest brief pressure will make a deep, permanent mark in that concrete. After the concrete has partially dried, you can still make a mark in it, but you have to push harder for longer, and your hand will make less of an impression. And once that concrete is totally dry, if we want to change its form, we can do it, but we usually have to do something like this. So I want to emphasize that with human development, it's never too late. We never give up on people. But just like with concrete, it's just much easier and less expensive and more effective to shape human development very early, when the brain is growing rapidly and is most sensitive to outside influence, just like wet concrete. So how does this second key concept of critical periods apply to human development? This graph I'm about to show you describes when the human brain is growing most rapidly and is most sensitive to outside influence, whether for better or for worse. So what you see is the brown line on the bottom is seeing, hearing, and touch. The yellow line is language and speech. The blue line is higher cognitive functions like reading and math and critical thinking. So you see that starting at birth, the red line on the left, there's a very rapid period of development. And there is age 4. This graph is not showing us when children learn the most letters, for example. What it's showing is the brain's windows of development, when the concrete is the wettest and most susceptible to environmental influences. What this graph tells us is that grade level reading actually begins at birth. And by age 4, as you see, the concrete has actually already started to harden. This next graph shows the trajectory of critical periods for executive function and self-regulation skills. Those are often, the skills that we often describe as the soft skills that Secretary Hosemann was emphasizing. These are the set of cognitive processes that enable us to control impulses, focus attention, persist with difficult tasks, set and achieve goals, work ethic kinds of skills. These are the skills we must have to be successful in school. But as you see, they begin developing long before we can even walk. You'll see that there's rapid development from birth to age 5, leveling out right around the time children enter school. You'll also notice that between ages 4 and 5, a child's executive function skills are developing rapidly. That's an especially important period for the development of these really critical skills. But what's important to remember is that human development is cumulative. So taking advantage of that opportunity between ages 4 and 5 depends on all of the prior development that's occurred occurred from birth to age 4. So I'm going to show you this short video of a child who's about 36 months old, just turning 3, that shows the tremendous skills a child develops in 36 months in a supportive environment, and how he builds on those skills to develop new ones. So that's work ethic. So the science of human development that I've been talking about is not new. This has been true for thousands of years. But while the foundational importance of early human development has not changed, the world that young children are growing up in has changed enormously. In 1940, fewer than 1 in 10 women with children under age 6 were working outside the home, and today almost 7 in 10 are. 2/3 of children from birth to age 5 now have all residential parents in the workforce. Over half of American children under age 5 are in out-of-home care for an average of 36 hours a week, often starting in infancy. So in other words, most young children today are spending a large proportion of their early years in childcare. So this graph shows the number of hours a child spends in a year of full-time, full-day pre-K. And we think of those almost 1,200 hours as early education. But children with working parents who enter full-time childcare as an infant will have spent almost 12,000 hours in childcare by the time they reach kindergarten. So pre-K is actually a small number of hours, fairly late in children's development from a scientific point of view. And those 12,000 hours are occurring during the most critical period of children's development. Childcare is where many children are spending the most time when they're the youngest and at the most critical stage of development. In fact, childcare and the quality of that childcare is having a profound impact on the development of America's children. So while we've long thought of pre-K as early education, it's childcare that's having the most significant impact on many children. That's why I think it's fair to say that childcare is actually America's most important early education program. So this is the critical implication of what science is telling us. Over the past century, we have come to equate education with schooling. But education really means human development, which occurs in a continuum that begins prenatally and extends through adulthood. And in fact, school is just one place, and one fairly narrow place, where human development occurs. We make a big mistake when we think that early childhood education means sending children to school earlier, when they're 5 or 4 or even 3. We have to remember that early childhood education means early development, not early school. Young children are hardwired to learn. They're highly susceptible to their environments, wherever that is and whatever we call it. So what the science of human development tells us is that the common distinction that we make between preschool and childcare is simply false. So this is a graph that some of you may have seen by Nobel Prize-winning economist James Heckman, which shows the rates of return to human capital investment across the lifespan. What this graph illustrates is that the earlier an investment is made, the greater long-term payoff that investment will have. The reason for this is that the education process, or in other words, the human development process, is cumulative. Each stage builds on the prior one. So the payoff on investments in high school or college or job training depends on the prior investments that have been made. That's why investing in early childhood has the highest payoff, because investments made at that period increase the value of investments all down the line. This doesn't diminish the importance of K-12 schools and post-secondary education. The point is that the effectiveness of those investments depends on investments made in early childhood. All subsequent investments depend on the foundation that's laid in children's earliest years. And as you see, the very highest return is from investments made in the first 3 years, the first 3 years of a child's life. So this seems to many people to make a lot of sense. Public policy always lags behind new knowledge and understanding. And as you see in this graph, education is probably no exception. I want to close with one of my favorite quotes from President Hoover's address to the White House Conference on Child Health and Protection that he convened in 1930. He said, "We aim to set children's feet upon sure paths to health and well-being and happiness. Let no one believe that these are questions which should not stir a nation, that they are below the dignity of statesmen or governments. If we could have but one generation of properly born, trained, educated, and healthy children, 1,000 other problems of government would vanish." Thank you.